Nova Scotia, 1984. A hidden valley where poverty bred silence and bloodlines folded in on themselves until family became fate. What the world would later call monstrosity was never born from evil, only from neglect that lasted too long and mercy that never came. Nova Scotia, 1984. A valley hidden beneath fog and memory, where the hills rose steep and close like ancient jaws, swallowing sound before it could travel. The people who lived there said the world forgot them long ago. The roads were dirt, the kind that turned to rivers when rain fell, and the trees leaned inward as if conspiring to keep the place unseen. Beyond those trees, past the last power line, the Goler family made their home, a patchwork of shacks and sagging roofs scattered across the South Mountain slopes. To outsiders, it was wilderness. To the Golers, it was a kingdom built from nothing but blood and endurance. Those who stumbled upon the valley by accident said it felt wrong, not haunted, exactly, but emptied of time. No engines, no voices, only the soft hiss of wind through spruce and the slow creak of wood expanding in damp air. There were children there, pale and quiet, their eyes too old for their faces. They moved in clusters, barefoot even in cold weather, their laughter thin and uncertain, like they were imitating something they had once heard rather than felt. The Goler name carried a strange weight in nearby towns. People spoke it in low tones, followed by pauses. They were said to be poor, said to be strange, said to be family in ways that didn't bear thinking about. Yet few ever went to see for themselves. It was easier to keep the mountain as myth, a place where poverty bred its own rules. The government sent aid now and then, but it rarely reached the end of the road. The valley consumed good intentions the way it consumed light. Inside the Goler homes, rooms were cramped and airless, the smell of damp wood and unwashed fabric thick enough to taste. Windows were nailed shut against winter winds, and the same fire that warmed them filled their lungs with smoke. There was no order, no privacy, only survival. Food was scarce, work scarcer, and the line between need and desire blurred with each passing year. No one in the valley questioned the way things were. The elders had been born there, as had their parents and their parents before them. They spoke of the outside world like a rumor, something far away, unreachable, untrustworthy. Within those hills, family was everything, even when family became something dangerous. Generations folded upon themselves, and silence became a kind of faith. By the time the rest of Canada remembered the Goler name, the damage had already been done. What the world would later call abuse, the Golers called normal. What outsiders saw as horror had grown, seed by seed, in the soil of neglect and isolation. The valley had not been forgotten by accident. It had been allowed to disappear, and in that disappearance, something monstrous was born. South Mountain was not the kind of place you found by mistake. It rose from the earth like a warning, its slopes dense with spruce and stone, its paths twisting until even locals lost direction. Those who lived there rarely left, and those who left rarely returned. For the Goler family, the mountain was more than home. It was inheritance, a geography of isolation that became identity. Generation after generation, they built their lives in its shadow, breathing the same damp air, drawing water from the same rusted pump, and marrying from the same narrow circle until bloodlines blurred into a single name. They had lived that way for decades, long before 1984, long before the headlines. What began as survival hardened into ritual. The world outside their valley was distant, spoken of with suspicion and envy. Townspeople from Kentville or Berwick were described as soft, corrupted by money and pride. The Golers called themselves mountain folk, as though the height of the land excused the depth of their poverty. Their shacks clung to the slopes like wounds that refused to heal, patched with tar paper, cardboard, and rusted tin. Inside, generations crowded together, parents, children, grandparents, and cousins, all sharing the same rooms, the same breath, the same unending hunger. When snow came, it sealed them in. When spring thawed the roads, no one ventured down. The mountain bred its own rules, its own silence. Work was scarce. Education, rarer still. Children grew into adults without ever seeing a school, without ever learning that the rest of the world lived differently. To them, The mountain was not a prison, it was the only map they knew. The Golers had a way of looking at one another that unsettled outsiders. There was no sense of boundary, no recognition of lines that should not be crossed. Love and control existed in the same gesture. Desire and discipline blurred. Fathers became uncles, brothers became husbands, and children became both victim and witness. It was not spoken of as wrong. It was spoken of as life. In the absence of outsiders, morality folded inward until it meant whatever the elders said it did. The land itself seemed complicit. Fog hung low, muting sound, hiding what should never have been hidden. The forest grew thick and dark around their homes, and in that darkness, generations repeated the same mistakes, not from malice, but from inheritance. The bloodline had turned back upon itself, curling tighter each decade like a vine choking its own stem. Those who later studied the clan would call it inbreeding, genetic decay, social collapse. But such words felt sterile compared to the reality. What happened on South Mountain was slower, quieter, more human. It was what occurs when isolation becomes eternity, when need replaces law, when the only world you know is the one that's killing you. And through it all, the mountains stood unchanged, vast, indifferent, watching as the family beneath it devoured itself in the name of survival. The children of South Mountain were born into silence. Their world stretched only as far as the valley's edge, hemmed in by forest and fog, and beyond that border lay a world they were told not to trust. They learned to speak in whispers, to move quietly through rooms where the floorboards sagged and the air smelled of damp wood and smoke. There were no school bells, no books, no desks. Their lessons came from the sounds around them, the hiss of the stove, the rasp of breath, the soft creak of doors that were never meant to close. From the moment they could walk, they were taught the rules of the household: speak when spoken to, obey without question, and never, ever talk about what happened after dark. Their mothers rarely spoke in full sentences. Their fathers carried authority in silence alone. The older children helped raise the younger ones, repeating what had been done to them as though it were duty, as though cruelty had been passed down like heirloom furniture. It was not spoken of as harm. It was spoken of as family business. Outside the valley, other children carried backpacks and learned their letters. Inside, the Goler children learned endurance. They learned to stay small when footsteps approached, to swallow questions before they left their mouths. Hunger was a constant companion. Meals were sparse, sometimes nothing more than a slice of bread, a spoon of beans, or nothing at all. They grew thin but wiry, eyes hollow yet alert, like animals that had learned to live in the dark. When a government worker or a priest would occasionally visit, the children froze, not out of shyness, but fear. They had been warned that outsiders took children away, that they lied, that they were the real danger. So they smiled, said nothing, and returned to their corners. The silence protected them, or so they were told. But silence also buried them. At night, the valley fell into a stillness that felt alive. From the shacks came noises no child should hear: whispers, footsteps, the groan of beds shifting under weight. The younger ones pretended to sleep, clutching threadbare blankets, counting breaths until morning. Some prayed without knowing to whom. Others learned not to pray at all. Their faith, if it existed, was fear wearing a different name. In time, the children stopped looking toward the world beyond the mountain. They accepted what they saw as the only way to live. They did not dream of escape because they did not know there was anywhere to escape to. Their minds, like the roads around them, ended in mud. They played in the dirt, mimicking the adults who had stolen their childhoods, repeating words they did not yet understand. And when one cried, another would hush them quickly, not out of comfort, but out of habit. Noise invited notice. And notice, in the Goler Valley, was the most dangerous thing of all. Faith in the valley was not the kind that came from Scripture. It was born of hunger, loneliness, and the slow decay of understanding. The Goler elders spoke of God the way they spoke of weather, something distant, unpredictable, and beyond interference. Church was a story told by those who lived near the towns. The Golers had their own gospel, one made from fear and dirt, a theology cobbled together from half-remembered sermons and superstition. They believed that God's eyes stopped where the forest began, that sin could not exist where no one came to judge it. The mountain, they said, was their sanctuary, a place beyond the reach of law and heaven alike. In the evenings, when the air turned cold and the light faded, the elders would gather the younger ones and speak of purity. Their words were slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning that never reached truth. They said obedience was holiness. They said family was sacred because it was all they had. And when the children asked questions, the answers came sharp and final. God sees nothing in the hills. There was comfort in that phrase, a permission that disguised itself as faith. It allowed anything to happen so long as it remained unspoken. The Bible still sat in some of their homes, its cover cracked, its pages stained with smoke. It was read aloud now and then, not for wisdom, but for justification. Verses about submission, discipline, and sin were recited like commandments, each one bent to fit a purpose it was never meant to serve. They called cruelty correction and suffering purification. Love, in their language, was indistinguishable from control. To the Golers, the outside world was corruption, cities full of liars and thieves, churches built by hypocrites. On South Mountain, they were pure because they were forgotten. Poverty was not a curse, but proof that they were chosen to live apart. The elders taught that outsiders were dangerous, that their rules were traps, their schools poison. So when a child cried, the sound was met with scripture, not solace. When pain came, it was explained as endurance, a test to prove worth. Over the years, faith became less about belief and more about repetition. The same words were spoken over the same sins until meaning dissolved. Prayer became habit, habit became law, and law became violence disguised as virtue. They believed that what happened in the valley stayed unseen not just by people, but by God himself. And in that imagined blindness, they found freedom, not the kind that saves, but the kind that corrodes. The gospel of the hills was not written in ink. It was carved into the silence of generations, passed from mouth to mouth until it sounded like truth. A creed without compassion, a ritual without redemption. It promised nothing but secrecy and delivered exactly that. In those woods, faith was not a light. It was a shadow, stretching long and dark over every child who was taught that holiness meant never being seen. Silence ruled the valley long before anyone thought to break it. It wasn't the peaceful kind, but a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the skin, the sort that swallowed noise before it could travel. Outsiders who drove down those dirt roads felt it instantly, the shift in air, the way the trees seemed to lean closer, the strange stillness between the wind's breaths. Some said the mountain listened. Others said it didn't need to. It already knew. The first thing they noticed was the smell, damp wood, rot, smoke, and something else beneath it, something human that clung to the air like guilt. The Golers didn't notice it anymore. They had lived in it too long. The reek of unwashed clothes, of animals kept too close, of soil and sweat and sickness, had become the valley's scent. It seeped into the walls, the blankets, the people. The smell was their signature, their warning. Neighbors from nearby villages told stories about it, how even the birds flew wide around that stretch of woods, how dogs refused to go near the old shacks at dusk. They called it cursed ground, though none could name the curse. They didn't need to. Everyone understood that the valley was wrong. Those who passed through never stayed. Travelers who lost their way on the mountain road spoke later of windows covered with rags, of shapes moving behind them. They said no one waved, no one called out. Just eyes staring from the dark, waiting for you to keep moving. The air there was thick, heavy with something unspoken. It was not the poverty that unsettled people, poverty they had seen before, it was the silence. A silence so complete it felt deliberate. Within that quiet, life continued, if it could be called life at all. The children played without laughter. The adults spoke in mutters. Even the dogs barked only once before falling still, as if the valley itself demanded obedience. When night fell, the dark pressed close, swallowing everything but the faint orange glow of lamps through cracked windows. No music. No radios. Just breathing, creaking, and the occasional cry that ended too quickly. Rumors spread in town about what happened there. But the silence worked better than any denial. No one from the valley ever came to contradict the stories, and no one wanted to go up and prove them true. Police drove through once in a while, headlights sweeping over collapsed fences and mud tracks, but the reports always ended the same: nothing to see. The valley had learned to protect itself through stillness. Words could expose, noise could draw attention, and attention was dangerous. The Golers kept their secrets buried in that quiet, the way others might bury their dead. Even when the wind blew hard enough to rattle the roofs, the sound stopped at the tree line. The silence held. It was their armor, their curse, and their confession. The truth began to leak from the valley not in words, but in a drawing. It was handed over by a small, thin child with hollow cheeks and eyes that never quite met anyone else's. The paper was torn from a grocery bag, creased from being hidden too long. The teacher almost didn't look at it. She was used to rough sketches, stick figures, and the strange symbols children drew when they couldn't explain what they felt. But this one stopped her hand. The lines were frantic, dark, drawn over and over again, as though the pencil could not erase what the child had seen. In the center of the page were shapes that resembled people, adults, children, bodies too close together. Above them, written in an uneven scrawl, were two words: the games. The teacher, Mrs. Harlow, had taught in rural Nova Scotia long enough to recognize the signs of neglect: dirty clothes, missed meals, the blank stares of children who had learned not to speak. But this was something different. She asked the child, softly, what the drawing meant. The answer came like a whisper learned by heart. "It's what we do at home," the child said. Everyone plays. There was no fear in the voice, only confusion, as though explaining something ordinary. That calmness chilled her more than any confession could. That evening, Mrs. Harlow sat alone in her classroom long after the others had gone. The drawing lay before her under the pale hum of the overhead light. She tried to make sense of it. Perhaps the child had misunderstood something. Perhaps the image was symbolic, exaggerated, imagined. But her instincts told her otherwise. Children don't invent horrors they can't name. They draw them because they have no words. The next morning, she brought the matter to the principal, who frowned, uncomfortable, and said they would look into it. A report was written, filed, and soon buried under others like it, routine notes about truancy and welfare checks that never reached the valley. The silence swallowed it whole. But Mrs. Harlow couldn't forget the child's eyes, not frightened, not defiant, just empty. She began to notice small things she hadn't before: the way the children from South Mountain flinched at sudden sounds, the way they watched one another before answering questions, how their drawings shared the same heavy lines, the same faceless figures. Rumor had always clung to the Goler name, but rumor is easy to dismiss until it grows flesh. That crude drawing became the first crack in the wall of silence that had stood for generations. It haunted her dreams, those frantic pencil strokes looping like cries trapped on paper. She would later say she didn't uncover the truth. It found her, crawling out from the valley disguised as art. And once she saw it, she could never unsee it. The mountain, for the first time, had begun to speak, and what it whispered would change everything. The first investigators came expecting neglect, unwashed clothes, empty cupboards, the kind of poverty that filled their files, but rarely reached the news. What they found in the valley was something colder. The children greeted them with the wary silence of animals taught not to trust sudden movement. Their eyes darted toward the adults before answering, their hands fidgeting in their laps as if invisible strings pulled at their fingers. At first, their words were vague, stories of games, of rules, of family gatherings that always ended in quiet. It was the tone, not the content, that unsettled the investigators. The children spoke as though describing chores, not crimes. The smallest ones talked in fragments. "We have to play," one said. "It's what families do." When asked who made the rules, the child shrugged. Everyone, that word hung heavy in the air. Everyone. No single name to accuse, no clear line between victim and perpetrator. What the outsiders would later call abuse, the children understood as inheritance. They spoke of rooms where the air smelled of sweat and smoke, of nights where adults whispered prayers that made no sense, of mornings when pain was explained away as love. As the questioning deepened, The details grew darker. They described the shack where the games took place, the beds shared by too many bodies, the way the door never locked because it was never meant to. Some children cried. Others didn't. The older ones stared at the floor and recited memories like lessons learned by rote, their voices stripped of emotion. For them, horror was not an event, it was routine. Investigators filled notebooks until their hands shook. Each sentence pulled another thread from the valley's silence, and with every word, the pattern of a buried history emerged. The same acts repeated generation after generation, fathers to daughters, brothers to sisters, cousins to cousins, all justified by poverty, by ignorance, by the belief that the world outside would never care. The adults told the children that outsiders lied, that the law was the enemy, that family was the only truth. And so the children kept their pain tucked inside until someone finally asked the right question, and even then, they answered as though confessing to something they did not understand. When the interviews ended, the room fell quiet except for the sound of pencils scratching against paper. The investigators looked at one another, pale and disbelieving. They had seen cruelty before, but not this, not a system of horror sustained by silence, disguised as kinship, sanctified by habit. As the children were led away, their small hands clutching stuffed animals and broken toys, one turned back to ask a question that none of the adults could answer. "Will we still have to go back?" The words hung there, trembling in the air like a curse. And in that moment, every person in the room knew, whatever lived in the valley had not been born of madness alone. It had been cultivated, generation by generation, until it became the only language those children knew. They came up the mountain in pairs, clipboards on their laps, the smell of wet pine seeping through the car vents. To them, the assignment sounded familiar, another case of rural poverty, another family in need of food vouchers and welfare checks. But when the social workers reached the Goler property, the first thing that struck them was not the sight of the shacks, but the stillness. No dogs barking, no voices, only the wind dragging through the trees. The houses leaned against one another like survivors of a storm, patched with tar paper and tin, smoke drifting from chimneys that should not have worked. Children watched from doorways, faces pale against the gloom, eyes too knowing for their age. Inside, the air was thick with rot and damp wood. Mattresses lay on the floor, blankets crumpled, the smell of old sweat clinging to everything. A single bulb flickered overhead, its weak light revealing drawings pinned to the wall, stick figures holding hands in circles, their smiles too wide. The workers began their questions gently, asking about food, about school, about family. The answers came slow and tangled. Everyone was related, yet no one could explain how. A girl pointed to an older man and said, "He's my uncle." And my dad, another child, said the same of her brother. Names blurred. Relationships folded inward until the tree had no trunk, only branches wrapping around each other, suffocating the roots. What began as a welfare visit turned into something else. The workers realized they were not looking at neglect. They were looking at an entire world built on secrecy. Every adult carried the same wary expression, defiance mixed with exhaustion, a look that said they had endured outsiders before and survived it. One man laughed when asked about the games, the sound sharp and humorless. "That's our business," he said, his voice flat. Always has been. The women stayed silent, their eyes fixed on the floor. The children clung to their sleeves, uncertain whether to hide or hold on. As the interviews continued, the workers' composure began to crack. Their notes turned from tidy handwriting to frantic scrawl. Each new story contradicted the last yet echoed the same horror. It wasn't a single act, but a pattern, a culture that had replaced affection with ritual, family with hierarchy, love with control. There were no boundaries left, no safe corners. The Golers lived in a closed loop, a world that had devoured itself from within. When the workers finally stepped outside, the daylight seemed wrong, too bright, too clean. One woman stood by the car, shaking, her clipboard pressed to her chest. "It's not just abuse," she whispered. "It's a whole system." They drove down the mountain in silence, mud splattering the windows, each afraid to speak what they had seen. Some later said they left part of themselves there, trapped in that airless valley where names had lost their meaning and sin had become a family trade. They had come expecting to save a few children. Instead, they found a lineage of pain so deep it had forgotten what saving meant. At the farthest reach of South Mountain, where the dirt road narrowed to a path of ruts and mud, the Goler shack waited like a wound. The house leaned sideways against the trees, its boards swollen with rot, its roof sagging beneath years of neglect. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Yet smoke curled weakly from a crooked chimney, and the faint sound of movement carried through the cracks in the wood. No one came there by accident. Those who did often turned back before reaching the door, claiming the air itself felt wrong, thick, stale, heavy with something unspoken. Inside, the walls wept moisture. The floors were slick with mud and old oil. A single bulb swung from the ceiling, its light too dim to chase away the dark. The air reeked of sweat, smoke, and unwashed fabric. There were no rooms, only spaces divided by hanging sheets, torn blankets nailed to door frames. The mattresses were flattened heaps of foam, shared by whoever lived within reach. No locks. No privacy. No safety. The house itself was a trap, built to contain not comfort but control. At night, when the valley fell silent, the shacks seemed to breathe. The children lay side by side, bodies pressed close for warmth, though warmth never lasted. The air was too cold, too damp, too thick with dread. They learned to sleep lightly, to wake at the sound of footsteps. The older ones knew what those sounds meant. They could tell by the weight of the steps who was coming, whether to feign sleep or to hide beneath a blanket. But there was nowhere to hide, not truly. The house was too small, too familiar. Its walls heard everything and forgot nothing. The Golers spoke of family, of loyalty, of obedience. But inside that house, those words twisted into something else. To defy was to invite punishment. To question was to betray. The children obeyed not because they believed, but because disobedience had a price they had already seen paid. The women moved quietly, performing chores without being asked, their eyes dull and unfocused. The men ruled not through rage, but through routine. The cruelty was not explosive, it was methodical, domestic, rehearsed. Visitors, when they came, were shown only what was safe to see: a small table, a pot of stew, a child too shy to speak. The rest was hidden behind blankets, behind silence. Yet even in those brief visits, the illusion frayed. The smell lingered. The children's stares lingered longer. One social worker wrote in her report that the house felt alive in a way that houses should not be. She could not explain it, but she was right. The Goler shack was not just a home, it was a mechanism, built to keep secrets in and hope out. Every nail, every rotted board, every whisper served the same purpose: to make escape impossible and discovery too late. The first police cars climbed the winding road just after dawn, their tires slipping in the slick November mud. Fog hung low over South Mountain, thick as smoke, blurring the trees into a wall of gray. The officers from Kentville had been warned to go slow, to expect resistance. The locals who gave directions had done so reluctantly, their voices low, their eyes fixed anywhere but the road. They don't trust outsiders, one had said. They don't even trust each other. The words stayed with the officers as the trees closed in, as the last stretch of asphalt gave way to dirt. When the shack finally appeared through the mist, it looked less like a home than the aftermath of one. The door hung crooked, its paint peeled to the bare wood. A rusted washing tub sat in the yard, half filled with rainwater and cigarette butts. Chickens pecked aimlessly through the mud. The officers stepped from their car and felt the air shift, heavy and sour. Then came the smell, thick, unmistakable, a blend of damp fabric, waste, and something older, something human. It hit like confession, raw and immediate. The first officer gagged before he could stop himself. The others said nothing. They pushed open the door. Inside, the dark pressed close. A single bulb flickered above the table, revealing faces that looked both startled and resigned. The Golers did not rise to greet them. A man with hollow cheeks sat smoking, his eyes glassy. Beside him, a woman rocked slowly, a child perched on her lap, expressionless. The officers' flashlights swept across the room, walls blackened with soot, broken dishes on the floor, a heap of bedding that looked as though several people had slept there. The smell of rot deepened. "Is this everyone?" one officer asked. The man nodded without looking up. "Everyone left," he said. His tone was flat, almost bored. But as they searched the shack, the truth unfolded in fragments, whispers from the children, stains on the bedding, photographs hidden beneath a loose board. Each discovery layered horror upon horror. The air felt thick with memory, as if the house itself remembered every act committed within it. Outside, the fog began to lift, but inside, the gloom stayed fixed. The officers took notes, collected what evidence they could, though evidence felt inadequate. You could not bag the silence, or record the smell, or quantify the despair in those children's eyes. When they stepped back into the daylight, they carried something invisible with them, the weight of having seen. One turned away to smoke, his hands shaking. "How long's it been like this?" he asked quietly. No one answered. By the time they reached the station, word had already begun to spread. The valley that had hidden its sins for generations had finally been seen, and what the law uncovered could not be buried again. Nova Scotia would never speak of South Mountain the same way. The Goler name, once whispered, was now written down not in rumor, but in record. The Goler family had long ago forgotten what it meant to look outward. Their world had turned in on itself, folding tighter with every generation until no one could remember who had first drawn the lines between kin and stranger. Marriage was no longer a matter of choice or love, but of proximity, the nearest body, the nearest blood. Cousins became husbands and wives, uncles became fathers twice over, and children were born already bound to the same cycle that had created them. No one questioned it. There was no one left to. The mountain had swallowed its own sense of right and wrong, leaving only instinct, hunger, control, and obedience masquerading as family. In that valley, blood was both the bond and the curse. The Golers spoke of their lineage as though it were strength, a sign of endurance. "We take care of our own," they said, but those words hid the truth of what that care had become. The children were raised to obey, to accept the touch that came uninvited, to endure the rituals that were described as affection. They learned early that family meant surrender, that love was supposed to hurt, and that silence was survival. The adults told themselves it was normal, that the outside world would never understand, and perhaps that was true. What existed in the Goler home was not madness, it was a culture without mirrors, a place where no one could see the deformity of their own reflection. As the years passed, generations blurred into one another. Children grew into adults who repeated the same acts, not out of cruelty, but out of conditioning. There were no boundaries left to cross because none had ever existed. The cycle fed on itself, like a snake consuming its own tail. The Golers were not monsters in their own eyes, they were simply continuing what had always been done. In their world, survival had replaced morality, and need had taken the shape of habit. When investigators later traced the family tree, the lines tangled into a knot: brothers listed as fathers, mothers as sisters, children appearing twice on the same page. It was less a genealogy than a map of decay. Yet, even in its horror, there was something pitiful, a portrait of people who had been cut off from every outside influence until they became their own ecosystem of pain. Poverty had not created their depravity, but it had preserved it, like a specimen trapped in amber. Those who met the Golers in person were struck not by violence, but by emptiness. Their voices were soft, their faces expressionless, their eyes dull with generations of endurance. They spoke of the games as if describing household chores, not crimes. They had lived so long in that enclosed world that morality itself had rotted away, leaving only obedience. The family had eaten itself, not out of hunger for flesh, but out of hunger for control, for dominance, for something to fill the void left by centuries of neglect. And when the outside world finally looked in, it did not find monsters hiding in the woods. It found people who had been left to become something monstrous on their own. The Kentville courthouse had never seen a crowd like that. On the morning the Goler trial began, Reporters lined the steps before the doors opened, their breath steaming in the cold October air. Cameras clicked, pens hovered, and everyone waited for a glimpse of the people whose names had turned from rumor to infamy. Inside, the corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper, but beneath it lingered something older, the tension of a community forced to look at what it had long refused to see. The words themselves, printed in newspapers and whispered in pews, seemed too heavy for the language. In breeding incest, the public spoke them like curses. When the accused entered the courtroom, the silence shifted. 14 members of the Goler family filed in, mothers, fathers, uncles, sisters, all wearing the same blank expression. They sat together as though attending a church service, their faces impassive, their eyes cast downward. To those who had never been near the valley, they did not look dangerous. They looked ordinary. That was what unsettled everyone most. Evil, people realized, did not always arrive with rage or madness. Sometimes it arrived quiet, tired, and unremarkable. The judge spoke softly, but his voice carried. The charges were read: sexual assault, indecent assault, gross indecency, acts committed over years, over generations. Each word struck the air like a hammer. The reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture what defied capture. The testimonies that followed stripped away what little distance remained between the public and the horror. Children's statements read aloud, their voices recorded on trembling tape, stories of games, of threats, of rituals that blurred the line between punishment and prayer. The gallery sat frozen, unable to look away. One journalist later wrote that the silence in that room felt ancient, as though it belonged to something far older than the Golers themselves, the silence of complicity, of communities that look away until they cannot. Each testimony peeled back another layer of that silence. The jurors shifted in their seats. The judge's eyes lingered too long on the floor. At moments, even the court stenographer's hands shook. The defense tried to argue ignorance, isolation, poverty, the absence of education. They called the family victims of circumstance, people shaped by their environment, not evil by design. But each time those words were spoken, another child's voice on tape broke them apart. The children did not describe confusion. They described routine. They spoke of abuse not as anomaly but as expectation. When the verdicts came, they arrived without applause, without relief. Guilty. 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 The words landed like stones dropped into water, vanishing beneath the surface almost as soon as they were heard. The Golers showed no reaction. Some wept. Most stared forward, lips still, as if the world outside the mountain had never existed. The reporters packed their notes, the crowd exhaled, and yet no one left feeling victorious. The trial had not simply revealed a crime, it had revealed a truth too large to name, that an entire family, an entire system, could live unseen for generations, devouring itself in plain sight. The law had come to the hills at last, but it arrived too late to stop what had already become history. They entered the courtroom one by one, small figures dwarfed by the weight of the room. Some clutched stuffed toys. Others carried nothing but the tremor in their hands. Each was sworn in with a voice barely above a whisper, the oath trembling in the air like something fragile enough to break. The silence that followed their words was the kind that prickled against skin, the sound of a room holding its breath. When the first child spoke, the voice was so soft that the court officer leaned forward to catch it. What came out was not a story but a wound. They spoke of nights without light, when the lamps were turned down low and footsteps moved through the dark like predators. They spoke of beds too crowded, of blankets that did not protect, of hands that should have comforted but only took. Each sentence cracked through the courtroom like breaking glass, each word dragging something hidden into the open. They described the games, the rituals that blurred family into something unrecognizable. There was no sense of shock in their tone. Only weariness, as if they had told these stories to themselves so often that they had become lullabies. The adults in the room struggled to meet their eyes. Reporters stopped writing. Even the judge's composure faltered. The children spoke of how mornings brought no safety, how the same people who hurt them at night made breakfast by daylight, how pain and normalcy had become indistinguishable. They did not know the word abuse, they called it. What we do, the jurors shifted in their seats, pale, motionless, caught between disbelief and horror. One girl, no more than 10, described hiding under the table while her younger sister cried in the next room. Her voice shook, but she did not stop. I wanted to run, she said, but there's nowhere to go on the mountain. Another, older, spoke with a strange calm. When it happens, she said, you don't think anymore. You just leave your body and wait until it's quiet again. The court stenographer's hands hesitated before typing, as though afraid to give permanence to the words. What haunted the courtroom most was not the violence itself, but the ordinariness with which the children described it. Their suffering had been structured, methodical, inherited. The family's rules were laws unto themselves, and the children had learned to obey because disobedience brought punishment worse than pain. It brought isolation. To be cast out of the family, even for a day, was unthinkable. The mountain was their whole world. When the final testimony ended, no one spoke. The air hung heavy, thick with the sound of muffled sobs and the scrape of chairs against the floor. Outside, cameras waited to capture faces that no longer looked human, too pale, too hollow, too stunned by the enormity of what they had heard. Those children left the stand not as witnesses, but as survivors of a place that had taught them silence was love and suffering was normal. Their words would live on in transcripts, in headlines, in memory, long after the valley itself faded into legend. For the first time, the mountain had a voice, and it spoke through the trembling mouths of its own children. In the small towns that circled South Mountain, the name Goler had always been spoken softly, as though too loud a mention might summon misfortune. The people there said they didn't know, that what happened in that valley had been hidden, that no one could have guessed what was unfolding just beyond their fences. But memory, when examined, tells a different story. There had been signs. The smell that carried on the wind in summer, the children who came into town barefoot and bruised, the way the adults flinched from questions or stared too long at the ground. Knowledge didn't arrive all at once. It trickled through the years, thin and undeniable, until denial itself became habit. Neighbors told themselves they meant no harm. They were poor too, scraping by on thin paychecks and colder winters, and it was easier to believe the Golers were merely unkempt, strange, perhaps a little touched by misfortune. To believe the rumors would mean admitting that something monstrous had been growing in their midst, fed by their silence. And silence, in a place where everyone's business was everyone else's, took effort. It meant not asking when the children disappeared from school. It meant ignoring the slurred laughter that drifted down from the hills at night. It meant looking away. There had been reports, years before the arrests, social workers who'd driven up the mountain, taken one look at the shacks, and left with hearts heavy, but pens idle. The files existed, buried deep in drawers beneath layers of bureaucracy. Phrases like domestic instability and possible neglect were scrawled in tidy handwriting. No one wanted to write the word that mattered. Poverty became the excuse, a blanket explanation that covered everything. They're poor, people said, but their family, the unspoken truth, was simpler. Poor families were easier to ignore. When the trials began, the town filled with outrage, as if discovering the horror for the first time. We never knew, they insisted. But guilt showed in the way conversations stopped when certain names were spoken. The grocer remembered the children who came in smelling of wood smoke and filth. The teacher recalled the drawings. The nurse remembered a girl's bruises explained as accidents. The evidence had been scattered everywhere, in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the pieces. No one had. Disbelief had been a kind of mercy, not for the victims, but for those who chose not to see. To admit knowledge would have required action, and action would have required confrontation. So the valley was left alone, sealed off by geography and indifference. Only after the headlines spread did the townspeople feel the weight of what they had allowed to grow beside them. They told reporters they felt betrayed, but deep down they knew the betrayal had been mutual. The Golers hid their sins in silence. The town hid its shame in willful blindness. And between them lay the same road that had always been there, muddy, narrow, and walked by too many who kept their eyes on the ground. The morning of the arrests broke cold and gray over South Mountain. Mist clung to the trees, and the dirt road leading to the Goler shacks turned to a slurry under the tires of police trucks. The convoy moved slowly, engines rumbling like distant thunder. Inside, officers sat rigid, some silent, some whispering prayers they hadn't said in years. They had read the reports, but none believed they truly understood what they were about to face. The valley was quiet when they arrived, too quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Dogs barked from somewhere in the trees, chains rattling against hollow tin. Then a door creaked open, and the first of the Golers appeared. The officers called names one by one. Men emerged from shacks in stained coats, women clutching children who stared blankly at the scene. Some were barefoot, some half-dressed despite the cold. They did not run. They did not shout. They simply stood, confused, as if unable to understand why the world had suddenly decided to look at them. When the handcuffs came out, a murmur rose, not protest, not resistance, but something closer to disbelief. For decades, no one had entered their world except to deliver pity or judgment. Now the law itself had come, and it came not as help but as reckoning. One officer later said it felt like stepping into a place where time had stopped. The Golers' homes were little more than patched wood and mud, reeking of waste and smoke. In the corners, children watched silently, their faces pale and unreadable. When the men were let out, some smirked, others muttered prayers. One woman wept, not for guilt, but because she feared what would happen to the animals left behind. None of them asked what charges they faced. They didn't need to. They had lived their entire lives under unspoken laws of cruelty and obedience. To be punished was simply another form of inevitability. By the time the last of the accused were loaded into the police vans, neighbors had gathered along the road, silent as tombstones. Reporters scribbled as cameras clicked, trying to capture faces that seemed almost ancient in their detachment. The Golers did not look monstrous. That was what unsettled the province most. They looked ordinary, worn, and strangely calm, as if being taken away was merely the next chapter of a story written long before they were born. In the following days, headlines spread across Canada. Inbred family charged in Valley horror, generations of abuse uncovered. The words were sensational, but the truth beneath them was worse than anyone could print. 14 arrests, yet countless scars left behind. When asked by reporters if they felt remorse, one of the older men smiled faintly and said, "It's what we were taught." That single sentence traveled farther than the arrests themselves, a confession not of crime, but of inheritance. The province reeled, the nation stared, and the valley that had kept its secret for a century was finally stripped bare under the cold light of justice. When the psychologists arrived, they did not come with sirens or handcuffs. They came with notebooks, soft voices, and the uneasy belief that they could explain what had happened on South Mountain. They interviewed the surviving children first, then the adults, piecing together fragments of lives that defied every known pattern of human behavior. What they found was something words could not easily contain. In reports and journals, they called it cultural collapse, a phrase that sounded clinical, almost sterile. But what they had truly uncovered was not collapse, it was decay, slow and inherited, the corrosion of morality passed down like a family heirloom. The Golers were not a tribe, not a cult, not even a community in the traditional sense. They were a family that had become its own world, one with no outsiders, no rules but survival, and no boundary between affection and violation. Over generations, isolation had erased the very concept of wrong. The mountain had become both kingdom and cage. There were no neighbors to judge, no teachers to correct, no authority but blood. And blood, over time, had turned inward, thick and poisonous. The psychologists spoke to the adults, mothers who could not define consent, fathers who saw ownership where others saw love. They spoke of hunger and routine, of teaching the young what was done before to them. It was heritage, not horror. When asked if they understood the harm, many looked puzzled. "That's how we were raised," one man said. "Ain't no law on the mountain," another woman, older, stared at her hands and whispered, "No one told us different." The experts noted this not as defiance, but as evidence, proof of a culture that had turned inward until it devoured itself. The younger children struggled with concepts like guilt and trust. Some wept when handed clean clothes, unsure if they were meant to keep them. Others flinched from kindness, unable to tell comfort from deceit. Psychologists described them as emotionally feral, but even that term fell short. They were children who had been raised without mirrors, no reflection, no comparison, no understanding that their world was not the world. In their final report, the experts tried to impose order on what they had witnessed. They spoke of generational trauma, environmental isolation, and the absence of education. They wrote of learned helplessness and distorted moral codes. Yet beneath every paragraph lay a truth too human for academia. These people had not simply been forgotten by society, they had been unmade by it. Neglect had not merely allowed the horror to continue, it had created the conditions for it. Cultural collapse, the psychologists wrote. But the phrase could not capture the reality that on one mountain in Nova Scotia, humanity had folded in on itself, generation after generation, until the word family no longer meant love, only ownership. The experts left the valley with their data and their diagnoses, but none of them forgot the sound of the children's voices, small, trembling, and still asking if they had done something wrong. The children were taken from the mountain in vans that smelled faintly of gasoline and new fabric. They were given blankets, juice boxes, and quiet promises of safety that none of them yet understood. Some cried without sound, their faces blank and hollow, while others stared out the windows, watching the trees blur into color and distance. For most, it was the first time they had ever left South Mountain. They did not know where they were going, only that it was away from the shacks, away from the dirt floors, away from the hands that had shaped their childhoods into nightmares. But distance does not erase memory, it only gives it room to echo. The foster homes were warm, clean, and orderly, a world built on rules the children did not recognize. Beds felt wrong. The sheets too smooth, the rooms too bright, the quiet too heavy. At night, some crawled onto the floor to sleep because it felt more familiar. Others hid food under pillows, unable to trust that meals would come again. When foster parents asked simple questions, "Are you hungry? Do you want to play?" the children stared as if the words belonged to another language. Normality was not comfort, it was confusion. Therapists tried to reach them through play, but play itself was a foreign concept. One boy, given crayons, drew only black lines pressed so hard the paper tore. A girl drew circles again and again, a hill, a house, a sun that never rose. When asked what it was, she said softly, "Home," then crossed it out with her fist. Another child refused to draw at all, saying that pictures made things real. The younger ones were the most fragile. They would flinch at footsteps, panic at laughter, and freeze when hugged. Safety felt dangerous because it had never been true before. Some of the older children began to speak slowly, their words halting, full of questions no one could easily answer. Why did no one come sooner? Why did they say it was love? If they were bad, why do I miss them? Their confusion frightened the adults who cared for them because it revealed how deeply the past had rooted itself. The Golers had taught their children that pain was belonging. Now they were learning that kindness could exist without fear, and it felt like betrayal. Years later, social workers would describe the survivors as divided between two worlds, half trying to forget, half trying to remember. Some built lives far from Nova Scotia, changing their names, erasing their origins. Others drifted between foster homes, institutions, and silence. A few began to draw again, the same valley, the same trees, the same dark outline of a shack on a hill. Always the same. No matter where they were placed, the mountain followed them, not as geography but as shadow. They had escaped the place, but not the inheritance of it. And in their quiet, in their drawings, in their trembling sleep, South Mountain lived on, a ghost of earth and blood that refused to let them go. When the trials ended and the headlines faded, the province tried to make sense of what had happened. The government formed a commission, as governments often do when horror becomes too large to ignore. Officials gathered in clean rooms under fluorescent light, speaking solemnly about systemic failure and rural neglect. They printed reports with embossed seals, pages thick with words like rehabilitation assessment. And policy reform, they called it progress, as though paper could mend what had been broken in the mud of South Mountain. Teams of experts visited the valley, took photographs, and wrote careful observations. They noted the poverty, the lack of education, the failed infrastructure. They mentioned, briefly, the generations of incest and abuse, but their tone was clinical, detached. In their summaries, the horror became data, a unique case of cultural isolation, multi-generational dysfunction. The language stripped the story of its pulse, turning pain into research. What could not be categorized was quietly left out. The final report was long, heavy, and deeply polite. It concluded that the tragedy had been inevitable given environmental and economic circumstances. In other words, the blame belonged to the land itself, the dirt roads, the poverty, the distance. Officials nodded gravely and spoke of funding for schools, new outreach programs, better coordination between agencies. But the money never reached the hills. The reports were filed, the meetings ended, and the province moved on. South Mountain remained what it had always been: forgotten. The same shacks stood in the same places, their roofs sagging, their walls patched with tin. The families that hadn't been jailed returned to their routines, their lives shadowed but unchanged. The neighbors still whispered, still looked away. Social workers came for a time, but the drive was long, the pay was low, and the valley resisted intrusion. Eventually, the visits grew less frequent until they stopped altogether. For those who had testified, the report offered no comfort. The children who had spoken in court were now teenagers, scattered through foster homes, reading newspaper clippings that reduced their lives to statistics. Some of them saw their family names printed in bold, followed by the phrase "case closed," but nothing was closed. The same cycle of neglect and silence continued, reshaped but not erased. Journalists came years later, searching for signs of progress. They found none. The poverty was still there. The fear still lingered. The land itself seemed unchanged, a place that swallowed history as easily as it did rain. South Mountain became a metaphor in lectures and textbooks, a symbol of systemic failure. But for those who lived there, it was no metaphor. It was home. And the government's report, bound in its fine cover, sat untouched on a shelf in Halifax, a monument not to justice, but to forgetting. The shack on South Mountain was never torn down. It sagged quietly against the wind, its boards grayed by rain and time, its roof half-collapsed beneath the weight of neglect. Grass swallowed the path that once led to its door. The windows, broken long ago, reflected nothing but the emptiness around them. Yet the people in nearby villages said the house was never truly empty. They said it breathed when the fog rolled low, that the wind that passed through its frame carried whispers too deliberate to be wind at all. Not ghosts, perhaps, just memory refusing to die. Children dared each other to go near it. They would sneak up the hill in late afternoon when the sun cast the valley in bruised light, laughing too loudly to hide their fear. Some claimed they saw shadows move behind the glass, others swore they heard the faint creak of floorboards. No one ever stayed long. The silence of the place was too heavy, too thick, as if the air itself remembered everything that had happened there. Even animals avoided the clearing. Birds never nested in the rafters. Dogs whined when led too close. The land seemed to reject life, holding its own quiet vigil. The shack became a kind of warning, a story told in low voices about what happens when isolation turns inward and love becomes rot. For a while, journalists came to take photographs, the kind printed in black and white beneath headlines about Canada's forgotten family. They posed outside, careful not to touch the door. The house loomed behind them like a wound that refused to heal. When the attention faded, the valley swallowed the story again. The newspapers yellowed. The reporters moved on. But the shack remained, its silence deepening with each passing year. Locals said that sometimes, on still nights, they could hear faint sounds from the direction of the old Goler property, the soft thud of footsteps, a door swinging open and shut, the echo of a child's laugh that ended too suddenly. No one went to check. They said it was only the wind or the shifting of old boards. But in the way they said it, there was always uncertainty. Some truths linger even after belief fades. When storms came, lightning flashed across the valley and illuminated the house for a moment, a skeleton of wood and shadow, defiant against time. No one rebuilt it, and no one tore it down. It was as though the land itself had decided to keep it, a monument to the silence that once ruled there. The people of Nova Scotia called it cursed, but perhaps it was something simpler, a place that had seen too much and refused to forget. And when the wind rose through the grass and rattled the walls, it did not speak in words, but in memory, the echo of a life that was never allowed to be ordinary, still whispering into the dark. By the time the century turned, the Goler name had passed from headlines into folklore. The valley became a ghost story, the kind whispered at kitchen tables and campfires, the kind children repeated without knowing it had ever been real. Stay off the mountain, parents warned, as though danger still lingered in the soil, waiting for the foolish or the curious. In schoolyards, kids dared each other to walk the road that led to the old shack, saying the Golers still lived there, pale and silent, feeding on whoever wandered too close. The truth was colder than the legend, because it lacked the comfort of superstition. There were no monsters in the dark, only people. What happened on South Mountain did not grow out of madness or curse, but neglect. Poverty became its own ecosystem, feeding generation after generation. The world beyond the valley moved forward, building cities, schools, laws, but the mountain stayed behind, sealed in its own time. When outsiders finally came, they called what they found inhuman, yet the word was wrong. Everything about the Golers was human, their fear, their hunger, their cruelty. What horrified people was not their difference, but the familiarity of it. Given enough isolation, enough silence, enough indifference, any society can fold inward and devour itself. The Golers were not a mutation of humanity, they were its reflection, stripped of illusion. In the years that followed the trials, the legend grew. Writers turned the family into cautionary tales. Journalists revisited the valley, crafting phrases that made the horror palatable: degeneration, moral collapse, the end of civilization's reach. But the real story was quieter. It was about how easy it is for a community to look away, for a government to forget, for suffering to vanish behind trees and distance. The Golers did not exist apart from the world. They existed because the world allowed them to. Now the mountain is empty, but the legend remains. Travelers who pass through say the air feels heavy there, as though the earth remembers. Some swear they've seen a figure at the edge of the trees, a child's outline, or perhaps a trick of the light. But the real ghosts are not in the valley. They live in the memory of what was ignored for too long. The horror was never just what the Golers did to one another. It was the silence that surrounded them, the indifference that made their world possible. And so the name endures, not as history, not as folklore, but as warning. The Golers remind those who tell their story that evil does not always come roaring through the door. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it grows slowly in the dark, unnoticed, until the day someone finally opens the window and realizes how long the light has been gone.